Now that I finished replacing the steering head bearings on this 1983 R80ST, I'm ready to install and align the front forks and to put on the top plate. Now I rebuilt the fork tubes and damper rods, so they're ready for install. And when I removed them, I marked them right and left. And I also did some measurements to determine where the bend was in the tubes. Fork tubes always get a little bit of a kink in them. So the lines here and here show me that that's where I want the front of the tube to be. So this is the face of the tube that'll point to the front when I install them. Now this is the original BMW top plate and acorn nut that secures the top of the forks. But as you can see, it's made out of pretty thin steel and it's prone to bending and it's not very rigid. So I'm going to install a top brace from Toaster Tan, and they kindly donated the top brace. As you can see, it's made out of much thicker material and it's much stronger. And the other thing is that the acorn nut on that actually has a deeper skirt, so it secures the top of the fork brace tightly to the steering stem. And that also improves stability and handling. So I'm going to put that on as I install and align the forks. Now on the bottom of the lower yoke is a slot. And what I like to do is take a large blade screwdriver and tap it in there to open that slot up a little bit. And then it's pretty easy to slide the fork tubes in. There. And I'll set them to the proper height. Once you pull the screwdriver out, the clamp will hold the fork tube, and I've aligned it so that line is pointing to the front. So the lines on the front face of both tubes are facing forward, so I've got them installed in the proper alignment so the bend in the tubes are on the same face of the tube, the front face, and that's going to reduce fork stiction on the lower slider and make the forks move much smoother. So the fork tube height is 160 millimeters. I'm showing about 159.99, which is close enough, and there you go, there's 160. And what I do is I put the screwdriver in with just a couple of taps, so there's a little bit of friction, and that keeps the tube from dropping. Now the measurement is taken from this base to the top of the tube, not from this little shoulder. It's all the way down here at the base. And so you just lay it in and adjust the fork until the top of the tube butts up against the bottom of the vernier caliper. Just like that. And then I check to be sure my line is still straight. So I'll set both of the tubes to 160 millimeter. So I'm ready to test fit the Toaster Tan top plate, and there's some pinch bolts here that go around the fork tube. I'm just going to back those out and then lay it on the top of the tubes, and it should slide down and go flush with the top of the steering stem. And then this is the Toaster Tan acorn nut, so I'm going to test it to be sure it goes in smooth without any interference. And it's turning nice and smooth, and that's good because that means the tops of the fork tubes are square. Now there's another part, which is this ring, and it has a bevel on the top, and the depth of that bevel is 0.7 millimeter. And what I want is to slide the ring in. It's very well machined, so you have to get it square, and then it'll slide in, and the bevel should be exposed, meaning the ring should be 0.7 millimeters above the top of the plate. So I've took my feeler gauge and I'm just going to lay it down and then ride my finger across, and it's even. Now if you find the ring is a little deeper than it should be or a little higher than it should be, you want to adjust your fork tubes just a bit to make sure you get exactly that 0.7 millimeter exposed top of the ring. So there's one for each side, so the other one goes in like that, and I'll verify that yeah, that's smooth right across the feeler gauge and the top of the ring. So that's sort of the test fit, and everything seems to be in good condition. Now that I've test fit the top plate, I want to install the pinch bolts here in the lower yoke. Now the pinch bolt torque is supposed to be 29.5 foot-pounds for this model bike. However, I'm using a stainless steel bolt, and I put anti-seize on the threads so they won't gall in the aluminum, which is how this yoke is made. It's made out of aluminum. However, anti-seize is a lubricant, so I want to reduce the torque so I don't strip the threads. So instead of 29.5, I'm going to take it down to about 25 foot-pounds. That'll be about a 15% reduction, and that should be safe. So I'll just go ahead and torque them up. There we go. And then I'll get the next one. Now when I'm done, I'm going to remove the top plate because I need to align the fork tubes to make sure they're parallel. So this is the CycleWorks fork alignment tool for testing whether the forks are parallel or whether they're pushed out or in. This part runs up against one of the tubes, and then the end of the dial indicator runs up against the other. And the dial indicator measures in 0.5 increments. Now I start at the top of the tube and lay it up against it and try to balance this end with the other hand, and then I sweep the dial indicator this way and look for the minimum reading. And it takes a little bit of care, but when I get it to the minimum reading, I set the outer ring so 0 shows no deviation at the top, so it's my reference mark. Then I will continue to test the fork legs in the middle and then all the way down to the bottom and see how much difference there is as I go up and down the fork tube. Now at the bottom of the fork tube, this is very delicate because if you pull the indicator, grab and pull on one of the tubes, you'll open it up and you'll get a false reading. So what I try to do is keep this square with the tube and support the weight with my finger underneath it, and then very, very gently sweep this side across the tube, trying very carefully not to push the tubes apart or to push them together so that I can get a good true reading. And it takes a little bit of playing around to get a sense of feel that you're at the right place. But if you just go slow, be careful you don't pull the tubes apart, you'll get a good reading down at the bottom. Now when I finish the measurement at the bottom, I found that the tubes were spread outward about 2 to 2.5 thousandths, which will cause stiction. So what I want to do is pull them in and get them closer to about 1,000th or even less worth of difference. Now, when I do that, when I pull the tubes, what's going to happen is there's going to be pressure put here on the lower yoke, and the aluminum in that yoke, with the tubes being pressed together, it's going to take a set after a while and hold that position. So I'll show you how I clamp the tubes, and then if I leave it for say an hour or two and then come back and measure, usually there's a change that's permanent because you've deformed the aluminum here in the yoke just a little bit. Now I've taken a wood clamp and tightened it up to pull the tubes together because they were a little bit wide, and I'll let that sit for about an hour and a half, and then I'll come back and redo the measurements from the top to the bottom and see how much change I've made in the parallelism of the fork tubes. I got the forks aligned in what's called the X-plane, and the bottom is off by less than 2/10,000ths. Now I want to check whether the fork tubes are pushed forward or backward. So I use a glass plate and I clamp it on one fork leg, and then I tap from top to bottom, listening if it rings. So the left leg here is in line. Now let's see what happens on the right. Okay, hear that? That means that the right leg is pushed back. So what I'm going to have to do is get them aligned. So to pull that right fork a bit forward, I've used about a 4-foot 2x4. I put some shop towels around it to protect the fork tubes, and then I'm using rope, and I made a loop around the cylinder, and then I twisted it inside the loop with a hammer so it's tight, and then I catch the handle of the hammer up against the frame. So this will pull the right fork tube forward and push the left fork tube back, and I'll let that sit for about an hour and then go back and measure and see if I've got everything aligned. And if not, I'll just continue with this technique until the forks are aligned so they're parallel front to back. Okay, I've been bending the forks in 30-minute increments, and it took about 2 hours. And let's test and see if we have any ringing. Well, that's good. And that's good. Let's go back and just check it one more time. Okay, so the forks are aligned in this direction, and I went back and I also checked with the micrometer to see if I had kinked them in and out when I was trying to align them this way, and they're right where they were. So I think we're all done getting the forks aligned. Now that I've got the fork legs aligned, I want to install the top plate from Toaster Tan and tighten up the acorn nut and the nuts that go on the top of the fork tubes, and then I want to verify that the alignment in the fork tubes hasn't changed, just to be sure there's no problems. Now, to install the top plate and the nuts, I've temporarily installed the handlebar risers, and I'll show you why I've done that in just a second. Now, the fork spring's about even with the top of the top plate, so I'll put the fork cap nut in, press down, and catch the threads just like that, so I can tighten them up on both sides. Now I've attached a handlebar just into one of the handlebar risers, and I'll show you why in just a second. Now I'm going to torque the acorn nut, and what I don't want to have happen is when I torque the nut, the handlebars turn and they bump up against the handlebar stops, because as I torque the acorn nut, that'll put force into the lower yoke and it'll tweak it, and all the alignments will go out of alignment, and I don't want that to happen. Now I'm just going to bring the torque up on the acorn nut to about 40 foot-pounds to seat it. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same tightening up on the fork cap bolts, but I'm just going to bring them up to about 15 foot-pounds, so they'll set on top of the sealing ring on the toaster tan top brace. So I don't need to give it too much, but I just want to get on it. Okay, and then I'll take the handlebar, put it over on this side, and tighten up this fork cap nut to 15 foot-pounds as well. Now I switched the handlebar to the other side because now I need to take up the acorn nut to 85 foot-pounds, and it's easier if I can put that other side of the handlebar on my hip, and then it'll pull into my body, which is a little easier to get the full 85 foot-pounds on the acorn nut. Okay, there we go. Now I'm going to tighten up the toaster tan top plate pinch bolts to 18 foot-pounds, so they'll clamp the rings. There we go, and I'll get the other one. Now the next step is to just loosen up the cap bolt, which I already did, and then take it up to only 35 foot-pounds. BMW calls for a much higher torque on their top plate than Toaster Tan does on its top brace. So I just need about 35 foot-pounds. And there we go. And then I'll switch the handlebar to the other side and tighten up the other one to 35 foot-pounds. So now that I had the top brace installed, I went back and measured the fork alignment in the x-axis using the CycleWorks tool, and I found that it had gotten way out of a line, almost 10 thousandths wide at the bottom. So that was a problem. What I did then was loosened up all of the Toaster Tan, the acorn nut and the fork top nuts, bolts, pardon me, and also the pinch bolts. And when I did that, the forks were pretty close to aligned again. So now I've got a problem. What's causing the forks to go out of alignment? So to figure out what was causing the problem, I started with everything tightened, and it was wide by over 4 thousandths at the bottom. And then I loosened everything except the acorn nut, which I set to 40, and the yoke to 25, and everything just about went back to where it ought to be. And I started increasing. I increased the acorn, and then I tightened the top fork nuts and took them up. And then all of a sudden, the problem showed itself right in here. When I tightened up the pinch clamps that tighten around the little ring in the top of the Toaster Tan brace, that's when everything went crazy. So it was this that was causing the fork tubes to come in at the top and go wide at the bottom. So I tried just working on the forks with the clamps to try and fix the problem, and it didn't work. So I had to scratch my head and come up with a solution for what to do. So the way I solved the problem is I loosened up the pinch bolts on both sides and got the forks to where they were pretty much aligned. And then I took the clamp, since it was going to push them wide when I tightened the pinch bolts, I put the clamp on, pulled the fork tubes tight together, and then went back and torqued the pinch bolts to 18 foot-pounds. And then I went and removed the clamp and made my measurements, and I was just about right where I needed to be. So I did a little more adjustment and got everything aligned again. And then to verify everything was good, I let it all sit overnight, came back out and did all the X and Y measurements, and everything was stable. So the forks are now aligned. So I'm going to install the fork sliders. Now the bike did come with aftermarket bottoming springs, but I'm not going to use those. So I put the foot back on the bottom of the damper rod, and then I put a little bit of fork oil on the seal to lubricate it, and then I just carefully slide it up onto the fork tube and take it all the way up. Now the fork springs are in it, so there's pressure on the bottom of the damper rod, so I can tighten up this bolt into the bottom of the damper rod. There we are. Now that I have the two sliders on, I want to check that the axle goes in smooth, and the side with the ridge on it comes in here from the right, and it should slide right through, line up, and go right in like that. And I can turn it easily, and it moves without any real restriction. That means I've got the fork tube set to the right height, and everything's good to go. Now, by the way, I did not actually tighten up the bottom bolts that mount the slider to the damper rod to the torque spec yet. They're still just a little bit loose. So this is the fork brace, and I'm probably going to repaint it, but for now I just want to see if it's going to fit correctly in between the fork sliders, and it fits in between these posts. So I want to make sure that it just slides in easy, and if I look at the end of the post on this side and the brace, they're in contact, and the same over here, they're in contact, and it's an easy slip fit. So it's not too wide and it's not too narrow, which means it's not bent. So I installed the axle loosely, and I put the fork brace on and torqued up the two bolts on this side to 15 foot-pounds. Now I don't have the sliders attached to the damper rods because I've got the fork springs in, and I just want to see how much stiction there is in the forks. So I'll just let them drop, but not off the forks. And I can kind of get a good feel then for how smooth they are. Then what I'll do is torque up the other two bolts here on the brace to see if it increases the stiction or not. Now after I torqued up the left side and tested the slider, there was a bit more stiction. So I think what happened is there's still a little too much room between the fork brace and the post, so it's pulling the fork tubes in. So what I'm going to do is put a thin flat washer on this side in between the fork brace and the post on both of them, and then torque it back up again and see what happens. Okay, I torqued up the other side now, and we've got no binding. So the fork brace is the right size. It's not pulling the forks in or pushing them out. So that's a good thing. So the front forks are installed and aligned along with the toaster tan top brace. And I did install the dust caps that fit on the fork sliders. Now, to attach the fork sliders to the damper rod, there's the Allen bolt at the bottom that needs to be torqued to 25 foot-pounds. I used the fork brace and I pulled up on it while I torqued the Allen. Now, since the springs are inside the tubes, they put enough pressure on the damper rod to keep it from spinning. So that was a straightforward way to torque up the slider bolts. Now, the brace needs to be repainted, so I'm going to remove it and do that. But this is what the completed forks look like when they're installed.